Auf Wiedersehen, Auf Wiedersehen, which is of course German for goodbye and good riddance. 80 years ago this week, the U-boats were ordered to withdraw from the US East Coast as the Americans began to master anti-submarine warfare. This brought to an end the so-called German Second Happy Time and brought great relief to the Allies in the Battle of the Atlantic. Yes, you're listening to We Have Ways of Making You Talk, where we can squeeze an anniversary out of any week.
Big times in the Atlantic, 80 years ago. Really were.
Yes, where the end of the, basically that's the end of the Second Happy Time. That's the end of the Battle of the Atlantic for the Germans, should we say? Should we go stick our neck that far out? They've lost. Come on, Jim.
Well,
you think they've lost the Battle of the Atlantic on the 2nd of September 1939 anyway, so...
I think they get to the point where they can't win it in May 1941, but they palpably lose the Battle of the Atlantic in May 1943, so a year on, because that's when the U-boats are withdrawn. But the Second Happy Time is really interesting because actually America entering the war doesn't help the British at all in terms of the Battle of the Atlantic. Because, of course, the person who's commander-in-chief of the US fleet, the US Navy, rather, is Ernest King. And Ernest King is a very, very ardent Pacific First man, rather.
Pacificist.
The Pacificist.
Yeah.
And this whole thing about Germany first, it's only kind of Germany first to a point. Because what it certainly doesn't mean is that they're not going to bother with the Japanese. And they're not going to bother with the fighting in the Far East or anything like that, which of course, as we know, they absolutely do.
Well, it means Germany first for the army and the USAAF. It doesn't mean Germany first for the US Navy.
Right, and it doesn't even mean, and it means Germany first for the US Army, but it certainly doesn't mean Germany exclusively for the US Army, because as people like John McManus have brilliantly pointed out, the US Army is in far greater forces by the beginning of 1943 in the Pacific than the Marine Corps is. Even though the Marine Corps hold the narrative. But what it means, so basically from the autumn of after the Mid-Atlantic Charter in August 1941, it's agreed that the Atlantic Fleet, the US Atlantic Fleet, will be properly activated, will play a part in convoy escort work and escort protection. And so after Pearl Harbor, most of that gets withdrawn. And because King is the head of the Navy and on the and obviously on the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and is an incredibly forthright, very suffer no fools, grumpy bastard. I mean, he's a brilliant man, but he's not exactly Mr. Charm. And everyone's absolutely terrified of him. It's completely obvious. Yeah. He kind of tends to get his way on most things, and certainly does when it comes to the Atlantic. So, of course, obviously, from the US Navy's point of view, the naval effort has to be focused on the Pacific, which means large numbers of the Atlantic Fleet get taken away. More than that, though, they start to say he introduces a thing called the Mid-Ocean Escort Force. So he says, hang on a minute, we're not going to do this now, so you now need to kind of go all the way over. And so this means that Canadian ships, escort groups, and British Royal Navy escort groups, instead of going halfway, meeting the Americans and then going back to, so you would come from, say, Liverpool or wherever, you would meet them mid-Atlantic and then you'd go back again with a convoy. You're now doing the whole thing. And then he says, oh, and by the way, what about doing a kind of a setting up short leg escort groups as well, going from kind of, Halifax in Nova Scotia down the east coast of America. And the Canadians sort of go, oh, okay then, very well, if that's what you say, because obviously they're the kind of the junior partner, but they're absolutely massively punching above their weight because, they start off the war in 1939 with something like 10 warships. By the beginning of 1941, they've got 81. That's kind of increased again by the beginning of 1942. And by the beginning of by kind of spring of 1942, 90% of their warships are in action, which is really not on at all. No. And that's because the Americans have kind of bugged out, basically.
Yeah.
And so the onus is on them. But the reason why there is this slaughter off the East Coast is because those East Coast shipping lanes from kind of northern part of the United States all the way down into the Gulf of Mexico and down into the Caribbean and then down the east coast of South America, down to Argentina, Brazil, all that kind of stuff. they are among the most congested in the world.
Yeah.
But they're not sailing in convoys because they're the far side of the Atlantic, and they never have. And obviously, being in a convoy is inherently an inefficient way of shipping because...
Yeah. Well, and there's the assumption they don't need to. How are the U-boats possibly going to get there? Because that does look improbable, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Initially, doesn't it? I mean, it seems entirely improbable.
Yes, and to be fair, a Mark 7 going from Bremenhaven all the way to the Caribbean, that's a hell of a journey. Yeah, that's a good 2.5 weeks to get there.
Yeah.
One of the reasons why there's this second happy time, these rich pickings, is because these sea lanes going down the east coast of America into the Gulf of Mexico, into the Caribbean, and all the way down the east coast of South America are some of the most congested in the world. These are just absolutely heaving with ships, but they're not in convoy. And the Americans haven't anticipated this because, as you point out, why would you?
Understandably, why on earth would you? Yeah, I mean, you're a long way from Brest, aren't you? Let's put it that way.
A hell of a long way, yeah. Yeah, you really are, and it's a hell of a trek to get out there when you're only.
But you can see by the same token though why therefore the concern that Vichy colonies, if they fall into the hands of the Germans, could shift the balance on this.
Yeah,
that they're worried about that sort of in theory.
Yes,
but they're not expecting it to deliver anything. The Germans to be able to deliver anything in terms of in practice, are they?
No,
and yet they still manage to, which is extraordinary, really.
Yeah, it is amazing what they managed to achieve in that first part of 1942, considering what their situation is. So at the very start of 1942, Dönitz has only got 91 operational U-boats. Yeah. I mean, they start off the war with, 47 or something like that in 1939. Yeah. Obviously, they've had losses and all the rest of it. Obviously, they've been building up and increasing the number of U-boats. But even by the beginning of 1941, that is not they've effectively doubled what they had at the start of the war, which isn't great, really, when you consider you're putting most of your eggs in that basket. But
it's also as baskets go and eggs go, it's the right one. If they're
it is.
Because the thing we talked about for wanged on about for more than 3 years now is that for the Allies it is all about supply, it is all about logistics, it's all about bringing your global resources to bear, and the actual one way to stop that is with U-boats.
But what's amazing is that the OKW, despite Raeder, the head of the Kriegsmarine, banging on about it, and despite Dönitz, particularly the commander of the U-boat, or the BDU, banging on about it, that is not appreciated. And there is an appreciation by the planning department of the OKW under General Warlimont that says, and I think it is March 1942, and it says the Atlantic and the Mediterranean are of equal strategic importance. That's no, they're not. They just aren't. The Atlantic is of far greater strategic importance to you in Germany. But what this means is, of 91 operational boats, means that they've got 23 in the Mediterranean because of the importance of the Mediterranean in Hitler's mind, because he's so obsessed with the southern flank and the soft underbelly, etc., etc. So that's 23 out of your 91. Then 60% totally are going are doing repairs, which means you've only got 12 available for the Atlantic in January 1942.
Gosh, that is ridiculous.
It's ridiculous.
So to what extent is he doing that to keep his allies, to keep the Italians on side? We know he doesn't think like that. We know he doesn't think in terms of, he doesn't treat his allies well. The Mediterranean isn't to do with that, is it?
No, the Mediterranean is to do with the fact that he...
Old debt to Mussolini? Because after all, he feels a sort of sense of political debt to Mussolini, isn't he, as the progenitor of fascism and all that sort of thing. Is there any of that in it at all?
It's vulnerability of Romania and the Balkans. So the Balkans, then Romania, then Plesty, the only source of real oil, crude oil that he's got. And it's because he's got the Eastern Front, he's got the Western Front, he can't have a third front. That's really threatened. Which is why he reinforced Rommel over in February 1941, etc.
But the Med kind of is part of the Western Front in the way the Allies are deciding to deal with it, isn't it?
Yes, but it is still...
The way to close down the Med is to close down the Atlantic. The way to close down
of course, but he doesn't get that.
Is to close down the Atlantic. I know, it's just... But the thing is
it's lunatic.
The thing is he's, it's blindingly obvious.
Yes, but the key to keeping the North Africa campaign alive is what?
Yeah.
It's shipping. Yeah. And where does that shipping go from? It goes from Greece, it goes from southern Italy, across the Mediterranean to North Africa.
Yeah, but you isolate the Med from the Atlantic and then you...
But the best way to protect your shipping is U-boats. So it's amazing because they've got 91 U-boats available, operational U-boats in January 1943. 23 in the bed. 60% of those 91 are undergoing some kind of repairs or whatever, and that means that only a dozen are available in the Atlantic. Really against Dönitz. I mean, he's absolutely incensed by this.
Yeah.
But what can you do?
Yeah.
But what's amazing, and obviously a handful more do manage to get across. I mean, it's very interesting reading Teddy Surin's memoir in his diary. He was commander of U-564. And, he can only get across there by using the Milchkur, which is, these larger U-boats which carry fuel, and you go and sort of
auxiliary supply U-boat. Yeah.
Right. And, so he gets those and, and then he has he's one of those that has a kind of a very fruity time in February 1942, because suddenly it really is happy days. There's lots of this independent shipping, and the number of ships that get sunk is pretty legion. 92 gets sunk in March 1942. 125 ships get sunk in May, 144 in June, of which 121 are sunk independently. So those are out of convoy. So the Americans finally get into gear with the convoy system in May 1942.
Yeah.
But not completely, setting up the convoy system doesn't mean that every ship is now in convoy.
No.
Because you've got supply chains and they've got to be maintained. And and obviously the whole problem with a convoy is you've got 40 ships.
Yeah.
Who would have been arriving in drips and drabs into ports, are suddenly arriving in a rush.
Can overwhelm ports and stuff and
all that. So it's
need
just
enough
simply
stevedores and all that. Yeah.
Yeah. So you might want to put a convoy system in place, but the simple economics and requirements of supply and demand are such that you just can't. You have to take that risk.
Yeah.
But what that means is that in June 1942. The U-boats sink 636,926 tons of Allied shipping, which is the most the U-boats sink in a single month up until that point.
Yeah.
But at the beginning of the war, Dönitz reckons they need to sink 500,000 tons a month to destroy the British shipping lanes. And this is only the third time they've achieved that.
Yeah.
And he has also had to completely, this basis of 500,000 tons was on the assumption that the British would need to keep importing their food.
Yeah.
Which, of course,
they haven't switched away from.
Now, it's really interesting because the harvest of 1939, 46 million tons of grain.
Yeah.
53 million tons by 1941, 80 million tons in 1942.
Yeah. Yeah.
So... In contrast, the German harvest is down every single year from 1939. And arguably their requirements are greater because they've now got vast numbers of slave labour who also need to be fed.
Yeah.
So their population has swollen massively rather than decreased.
Yeah. And even though what they want to do is starve some of those people to death anyway.
Yes.
I mean, because
but they still need to work.
Exactly. They still need to work. So let's the inherent contradictions.
But what is also really interesting about this, just about the whole critical, were we, Churchill sort of is my biggest worry was the Atlantic and all this sort of stuff. So total imports to Britain in January 1942, 2,006,000. May 1942, at the height of the second happy time, 2,214,000.
Yeah.
So in other words, they're absolutely static or going up. It's making no difference whatsoever.
Yeah.
And then they move, and so in July, Dönitz then goes, hang on a minute, they're now in convoys. This is not worth the effort going all the way across the Atlantic. It's not very efficient. So we'll then go into the mid-Atlantic. We'll go back into the mid-Atlantic. Yeah. But by this point, the British have cracked, or the Allies have cracked very long-range aircraft. This is the Liberators, the B-24s.
Yeah.
With their cavity magnetrons on, with Huff Duff, all this kind of stuff. And despite the fact that the Germans have the B-Dienst, their Bletchley Park equivalent, have cracked the convoy cipher, it makes absolutely no difference whatsoever, really, because the whole point is what you want to do is you want to make sure that the U-boats are not on the surface, which is where they do most of the attacking, because that's where they can operate at 14, 15 knots. Yeah. When they're under the water, they're at kind of sort of walking pace.
Well, but also intelligence-wise, it's mutual, isn't it? Because Ultra's cracked what the U-boats are saying to each other, so they don't actually mind that the convoy ciphers have been compromised, because it's a way of knowing what the Germans know.
Exactly.
And in fact, to an extent, telling them what they want them to know and what they want them to act on, so that they can then attack them themselves. I mean, which is the most extraordinary, sort of the other way round of using code breaking, is that actually it's a way of being not bothered about being compromised. Is sort of, well, it's not they're not bothered, but they're making use of the fact that the B-Dienst have got into their codes. Anyway, to change subject completely.
Yes.
Right. So I went to Spike Milligan's house the weekend before last, and all that. So and also we're going to be talking to Ian Hislop and Nick Newman soon about Spike and about the genesis of the Goon Show. So I've done a little bit of poking around and looking at biographies and stuff, and the biographies of Spike Milligan are wildly variable, mainly because he took such command of what was written about him and lied a lot or embellished or whatever. Particularly a lot of his life around before the war and after the war. And there's a book by his agent Norma Farnes that you, the minute you read once you finish the introduction that she wrote, you can think, right, this book is completely unreliable. There's no point trying to engage with it. There's a book by Humphrey Barclay, I think, who was a comedy producer,
right?
And is a massive Goons fan. But so I'm looking at after the war, Spike plays in this thing called the Bill Hall Trio, which is him and a violinist and a guy called Mulgrew, who was a bass player, and they did a sort of wild. They're dressed like tramps, and they did this sort of wild music thing with a virtuoso violinist in the form of Bill Hall, and Spike would do the jokes and all that. Anyway, they come to London, and Spike ends up gravitating to a pub called Grafton's, or it's known as Grafton's. It's now called Grafton's in Victoria, that's run by Jimmy Grafton, ex-Major Jimmy Grafton.
Yes.
And Jimmy Grafton was in A Company, 4th Dorsets. And We Have Ways regular fans are going to enjoy this moment as I succeed in linking Spike Milligan to the Battle of Arnhem.
Yeah, that's just genius.
Because Grafton was in a party that landed on the night. On the northern side came into the perimeter, and he brought in an artillery observation officer called Tom Rose, and they joined up with Breeze Force around Oosterbeek Church and the Light Regiment's artillery positions. And Rose was able to call in artillery from his regiment and was another source of artillery guided fire that helped on the perimeter, because he brought another radio with him and linked up to 64th Regiment and was able to bring in gunfire. That meant that they weren't relying on the radio link they already had. So the radio link they already had wasn't overloaded. So there was another source of artillery support and signalling because of the Dorsets landing that night with Brilliant. Jimmy Grafton. And
How amazing.
And Grafton ended up, Spike would sleep in Grafton's attic and all this sort of stuff in 1949, 1950. Peter Sellers would hang out in this pub with Seacombe and Michael Benteen, and they'd all hang out in this pub together. And Grafton was sort of Spike's initial agent and the script editor on the pilot scripts of the Goon Show.
No,
and called himself, And there's a lot of sort of Spike inspired argument about who actually. Because Spike was quite keen on the idea that he was a unique, a one-off, and that no one else had really helped.
Fair enough.
But Grafton was very, very, very much tied up in getting the Goon Show off the ground and getting Spike Milligan's career on the go. And he was at Arnhem. So there you go, ladies and gentlemen.
Yeah, well done.
Regular listeners.
Yeah, that's very good.
I've finally done it. But they'd come. Obviously, they'd come all the way from Normandy, with 43rd Division, and so he gets an MC, I think, Grafton, and maybe nudging into that and finding out exactly where. Because what's interesting is in one of the Spike biographies, it's all about Jimmy Grafton had swum the Meuse at Arnhem, and you're like, no, I don't think he did.
Yeah.
Not sure about.
He's swum the
well, exactly, but just sort of how kind of by the time an agent and a comedy producer have got this stuff put this into the Spike book, it's sort of detached from, because the implication is that he's a paratrooper in one of the books. He's not in the Dorsets. And so you have to sort of parse exactly who he is and where he's from. But he's in Martin Middlebrook's Arnhem 44. Jimmy Grafton is mentioned by name as, it's the most successful party of a company of the Dorsets that gets.
Well, isn't that amazing?
Absolutely.
I've been actually sort of looking around a little bit to see if I can find an infantry battalion to follow from D-Day to the end of the war. And I've whittled it down to 2 that I think would work. One is the 9th DLI, because they're the only ones who were there at the beginning of Normandy and all the way at the end of the war. There's quite a lot of DLIs, but a couple of them come out at kind of autumn of, winter of 1944.
Yeah.
And the other is the 4th Dorsets. So I'm trying to find out what there is and whether there's enough eyewitness accounts. And
they're territorials as well, so you've got that too.
I know, so which I like. I like that.
Exactly. So you've got that kind of, and
obviously they're local to me. So I feel kind of, I've written about the 4th Dorsets before in the Normandy book. Yeah. But it'd be quite nice to kind of follow that up, really. But it's just whether there's enough there to kind of sustain a book.
Well, you've got them at a big event there, big.
Well, exactly. You're hitting all the big notes, aren't you? All the fence posts, they're there. Yeah.
They go up into Dreel Church Tower. Gerald Tilley, the lieutenant colonel, they go to, and Philip Roper of C Company says, this is in the Middlebrook. He goes, we could see everything up to the trees which came down to the edge of the river on the north bank, but nothing in the trees on the ground which sloped steeply upwards from the river. That's where we walked. That's that section of ground at the west of the perimeter where the ground does slope up. Colonel Tilley said, gentlemen, we've bought it this time. I think he realised it was a pretty hairy operation. As for myself, I thought it unlikely we would get back. When I had my Company O group, I tried to water it down as much as possible and told them we were going to do an important job to help the airborne people. And then, then they're fed into the,
well, he's got his own Wikipedia page. It says here he was in the Bedfordshire and Hertfordshire Regiment.
Yes, and then transfers to the
James Douglas Grafton, 19th of May 1916 to 2nd was 86 was a producer, writer, and investigation. He looks a laugh, actually.
Oh, he looks like a proper chap. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
it looks like a lot of fun.
But what's really interesting is he looks after Spike when Spike's really on his uppers.
Yeah.
And Milligan writes about how he was depressed at the time and he'd have his depressions. And I just sort of think it's really interesting because Grafton would have known what men had been through. He would have known that people would have had combat fatigue or a long-term effect, because this is 5 years after the war ends. That he's got Milligan under his wing. Milligan's into his 30s by this point.
Yes.
He's 32 in 1950. He's getting on,
Yeah.
He's getting on for someone who hasn't found what he wants to do yet.
Yeah.
Especially in the arts. And I think it's really, really fascinating. And Grafton, he ends up doing all sorts of. He's known as Cogvoss, Keeper of Goons and Voice of Sanity. He ends up, as the sort of centre. This pub is where tons of people like Terry Thomas and Jimmy Edwards drink, and Kenneth Moore and Tommy Cooper. They all gravitate to Grafton's, which I think might be worth a visit in next time I'm in Victoria. At the Comedy Museum in Bloomsbury.
I think this is absolutely brilliant. We should go and play homage to the Grafton, shouldn't we?
I think we should.
But it's clear that he knew absolutely everybody. Terry Thomas, Dick Emery, Kenneth Moore.
Yeah. And he wrote
Hancock.
more than 500 programmes, including 200 sitcoms. I mean, he was a proper
lad.
But with the Dorsets.
I wonder whether he wrote anything about his time, or whether he's an IWM or something.
All right.
I'll look him up.
What you hear right now, ladies and gentlemen, is James Holland's
the brain, the
spider sense tingling.
Yeah, a little bit. I'm not going to lie.
Jimmy Edwards was also at Arnhem. He was a supply pilot. That's why he was he was burned badly in the resupply efforts. flying a Dakota, which is, I think a Dakota, which is why he had that moustache, was to cover his burns on his face.
God, it's amazing, isn't it? All these people. I mean, of course they were in the war because everyone was.
Yeah, yeah.
But it's a reminder, isn't it?
Yeah.
Of the totality of it.
Exactly, yeah. Jimmy Edwards was a member of the Guinea Pig Club, was shot down in his Dakota at Arnhem. Anyway, we're going to take a very quick break and we'll be back because I've succeeded in linking two of my favourite subjects. Welcome back to We Have Ways of Making You Talk with me, Al Murray, and James Holland. For those of you who've been long-term listeners, you probably think my mission is accomplished now that I've managed to link the Goon Show to...
You can stop now. You're retiring at the end of the week. Get We Have Ways Fest out of the way and that's it. I quit. I've done it.
Now, on the subject of which... We have Ways Fest. Those of you who, again, have been listening regularly will know this. Those of you new to it maybe heard me talking about it on Dermot O'Leary's show on Saturday morning.
Yeah, that was a good plug, wasn't it?
This is it. It's big week this week. We have Ways big week. We're all heading to Black Pit Brewery this week for our 3-day festival. The weather is set extremely fair. The big tents go up on Wednesday.
Actually, it looks like there might be a little bit of rain on Friday night.
Yes, which might not be a bad thing.
Yeah. It settles down the dust. Settles down the dust before the tanks
dust means death.
Dust means death, exactly.
So the tents go in on Wednesday. The beer barrels are being rolled into the site all week to cope with the logistical demands of our thirsty festival goers who did drink it dry on the Friday night last time. You know what? Last night I did a because we're recording this on Monday in anticipation of the world's greatest heat wave of all time, and I had a look at the list of speakers because I was tweeting about it, and to be honest, I was a bit taken aback by
quite a lot, isn't it?
Yeah, what we've managed to assemble, Jim.
Yeah, no, it's pretty impressive.
I mean, and you've just updated the program.
Well, yeah. So we've now got all the hardware talks scheduled. We've got the legend that is David Willey coming. We've got two T-34s. Two T-34s. We've got a Matilda 1. The worst tank of the war.
Shut up. We got a Matilda 1.
We've got Matilda 1.
No. Does it go?
Yes.
Oh, my God.
Yep. We've got an M10 Achilles. We've got Sherman. We've got a Stuart, which I'm quite excited about. Love Stuarts.
Matilda 1.
Love the honey. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Honey's are cool.
Covenanter.
Yeah. Really?
Yes.
What, that goes?
I'm not sure about that.
Well, no, it's a Covenanter. That's how the joke goes, isn't it?
Yeah.
Well, I don't know.
It's a Covenanter. But we got one. So what I'm really excited about is we've been talking, ever since last year, we've been talking to Monty's Men. Now, Monty's Men, I just want to stress, are not your average reenactors. These guys are, if anyone's read Confederates in the Attic, they're that level. They take it incredibly seriously. They only do Second World War stuff. They only brush their teeth with Second World War toothbrushes when they're in in the zone. Yeah. And they all look very thin and they don't eat and they only eat bully beef and boiled sweets and have tea with condensed milk. Yeah. And so they look really the business and they take it all very seriously. And they don't normally do public events at all. They just do it for themselves and they train using Second World War training memoranda and all that kind of stuff. Yeah. Anyway, we've been trying to work out how do we get armour with infantry with artillery, the classic holy trinity of all arms combat. Yeah. And with it looking realistic and not silly. So what we've come up with, and I'm really pleased about this.
That, dear listener, is the key part. Realistic but not silly.
But not silly.
This is the hard part. Yeah.
Okay. So what we're not trying to go into action. We're not trying to pretend there's Jerry just around the corner in the wood or anything like that. You're not going to hear machine guns chattering. What you're going to see is armour moving forward with infantry across a stretch of land. Yeah. So you'll see them manoeuvring in the way that they would manoeuvre. Yeah. Then as they push on through, the artillery will move up and set up, and then they will fire. But the visibility of seeing those three components together, moving together, will certainly put a thrill in my heart. Yes. I think it's going to look really, really fantastic. So we've set that up, and then we're having a kind of, you know, an armoured spin around bit where it'll be like a mini tank fest for an hour, where all the tanks will be in motion, beetling around, and armoured vehicles and
what's David going to be talking? What's David Willey going to be talking about?
Well, he'll be commentating on those with us.
For those of you who don't know, David Willey is the Tank Museum. I think it's fair to say. Yeah. If you've watched their YouTube input, you'll know he is a chap in a beard who seems to know absolutely everything about every nut and bolt of every tank ever made.
And what you do, he's basically got a green button which is on and a red button which is off. And once you press green, off he goes. And you might think that Al and I talk a lot about Second World War and war waffle, but when it comes to tanks, you ain't seen nothing yet until you've spoken to David Willey.
It's very exciting, actually. He is the font of knowledge.
He really is. So those two things every day are our two showstoppers, along with the firing of the heavy anti-aircraft guns with searchlight, which I should tell you can reach 5 miles skywards.
Yeah.
It's really cool. And then in between, there's lots of talks and all the rest of it. But as you say, the cast list of people that we've got, from Katja Hoyer to Saul David to Max Hastings to John McManus from the US, from Mark Milner from Canada to Alex Ritchie from Poland, from Jens Wehner to Bass Williams.
It's boggling.
We got Germans, Dutch, Austrians.
Yeah.
Canadians, Americans.
Yeah.
It's international.
It's truly international.
Actually, we should start calling this national. The International We Have Waste Festival.
Yeah, and we've live music.
Yes.
We've
Django Band. With a certain Ned Holland doing his retro songs.
Yeah, Jack Schick doing the story of his displaced family.
Yes.
His father was a Polish resistor, and his mum was his adopted family. I mean, his life story is extraordinary. He's joining us. We've the monarchy during the war. We've Boring War with Philip Payson O'Brien, who, if you've been following the war in Ukraine, you'll know is
Twitter sensation.
Twitter sensation, carving out space for himself, talking about the logistics of war and the important side of that. Sean Scullion talking about Spain in the Second World War. Often neglected. Jonathan Fennell, who I will fanboy tirelessly when I see him.
Me too.
Ian McGregor with his new book about Stalingrad, The Lighthouse of Stalingrad. That he's fantastic. Andy Chatterton.
Jack Mann. I mean, he's one of the last surviving members of the SAS and SBS from the war.
Yeah.
He was in North Africa, for God's sake.
Yeah.
He was in the SAS in North Africa.
I mean, he's older than the Matilda 1.
Yeah. Well, not quite. Yeah, he is, actually.
Well, yeah, he is. Of course he is. Yeah, of course he is.
And the good, exciting news is I think I'm going to have my Bedford there.
Ah, really?
Yes.
And what markings
1939 to 1945.
What markings are you going for with the Bedford?
Well, obviously, I'm going to make it Sherwood Rangers.
Right, okay.
Duh.
Right, okay.
Well, no, obviously.
Not if you're heading towards the Dorsets.
Well, I know. Well, the great beauty about it is you can always change. You can be fickle.
And then on Friday night with the Family Stories live thing, which I've been picking up with my daughter Scarlett, that I think
is it going to be good?
I think it is.
A little bit for everyone.
Well, what's really great is we've got people reading their family stories.
Amazing.
So people who sent their stuff in will get up and read their family stories to the audience. Which and you and I will be doing a bit, and some of our stars will be star contributors will also be doing it, but we've got some people who will be talking about their Uncle Alf, which is really I'm very, very excited about and looking forward to. Also, that's one of those things where it's been in my head for ages, and now we'll find out if it works.
Well, of course it's going to work. It's going to be great.
And with Maurice Blick, who's a Belsen survivor.
Yeah. PCA making his first return.
I know
the cravat is back.
The cravat is back. So lots and lots. And there's camping for the brave. I'm going to be staying in a Premier Inn. I'm just going to put that out there.
You're not camping in the...
No.
Snuggle up in the back of the Bedford.
No, that ain't going to happen. No. Though, I mean, it may be that's a cooler option than a hotel with busted aircon, but who knows? Anyway, so that's this weekend. So that's Friday. That starts on Friday. There are day tickets, so if you can't manage the whole thing, of course, you can pick the bit you fancy. That's wehavewastefest.co.uk, where you can get your tickets on the way, or just have Marvel at the Go look at the website and marvel at the thing you're missing out on. How about that? That's the other option.
Yeah. Anyway, we would love to see as many people as possible. It's a lot of fun.
We would, and we're recording most of it, so most of it will come back to you as content at some point. The other thing I want to talk about was briefly touch on was the passing of Ken Tout.
Yes, I know.
Died.
Brett Freeman. Awful.
Yeah. Because Ken. I mean, I interviewed Ken a long time ago about Sherman tanks in 2004, where we went to Crowborough to that collection up there, and he showed me round the Sherman they had there. Oh, look at this! This does that. Yeah, what's brilliant about this gun is it's stabilised. We learned to fire on the move, and he was so good at putting you there, explaining what it was like, putting you there, and reassuring you that you'd have done fine too, even though it was absolutely ghastly. Ken had this, and then if you've read any of Ken's stuff, and we did an audiobook right back at the start of the pandemic in 2020. We did one of his tank ! One of his books. His writing's really, really fascinating, and
so good. That bit, the whole bit on the Michael Wittmann Day, which is what is it, 9th of August, I think it is, when they they're just in those trees and their woods, and they're separated out, and they see all the firing, they see the Tigers come across. But earlier on, they have a fight with a Panzer Mark IV, and just where they are, and you can go there, and it's exactly the same spot. And he marked up a map for me. Yeah. So when I was there, you knew exactly where you were, and it was just as he described it in the book. He said there's this, you go down this track, and suddenly there's this kind of little, really narrow little valley, this weird valley, and they send off one troop down, and it's the Squadron Joker, isn't it, who's in there? He goes, who's down there, and he's grown a little Hitler moustache because it's funny, and they're on the radio, and suddenly they hear them being hit. And the silence, and then they see a Mark IV, and I think Ken knocks it out and sees it, and sees it knocked out. And then an hour later, they're ordered to go down and investigate. And so his tank goes doon into this little hollow, and in his description, he says it's about the size of a football pitch. Yeah. And it absolutely is. And width-wise. And you go, and he goes down there, and they have to get out, him and his tank commander get out and go and look for this guy with the Hitler moustaches. I can't remember his name off the top of my head. Yeah. Go and look for his, look for them. And eventually he sees him, and the guy is half out of the turret, just staring at him, but completely dead. Yeah. And there's this, you get this sort of shock and revulsion of seeing his really good friends dead, and also the just unbelievable tension of wandering around in an area where it's extremely dangerous because you don't know what's around the corner. Yeah. And then he also scrabbles up the bank to see the Panzer IV that he's knocked out, and sees the guy's been basically blown in half, the commander. And it's just so sizzling. And when you're there in this spot, you can't help but start feeling tense. And, your arms start to goosebump, and you can feel the hairs on the back of your neck. And it's just an incredibly atmospheric place. Yeah. Knowing what you know that took place there. It's one of the most memorable, brilliant bits of war writing I've ever read. That sequence.
The book is really fun.
Because it's just so vivid, isn't it?
It is. And Tank is 24 hours of fighting in tanks in Normandy, and he really captures that very long day because it's getting dark late, it's getting light early. You're lagered up, and maybe you get a couple of hours, but you've got to refuel, you've got to eat, you've got to rearm. You've got to figure out what on earth you're going to be doing in the morning. The whole thing. There's a fantastic photo of him with his crew in Normandy on the Tank Museum page. There's an obituary for Ken on the Tank Museum. There's a really great picture of him and his crew, and they're going through ration tins and smoking fags and like having a moment off. Really fantastic picture of. Snapshot of life in a crew.
Oh,
isn't that
God,
an awesome
that's good,
picture?
Isn't it? Yeah. He was such a lovely guy, and his wife was so lovely, and he couldn't have been a gentler, more sort of. He was just It was just a pleasure. Lovely to know him. Lovely to have met him. I feel really lucky that I did.
And I think he's another one of those guys who was a pacifist before the war and basically was resolved to having to... Because he was a Quaker, I think.
His parents were Quakers, weren't they? And they're very strict, and there was no drinking, and they had to go lots of chapel on Sundays and wear their Sunday best and stuff.
Yeah, and
I think his dad was a shoemaker or salesman or something like that.
Yeah, and he was
somewhere
resolved...
in Herefordshire.
Yeah, and he was resolved to the fact he was going to have to go to war and did, regarded it as his sort of as his bitter duty rather than anything else.
That's a fabulous photo, isn't it?
It an amazing picture?
Look at the tins.
And that they've got Ken. That it's that because that's just a picture taken on a crew.
Yeah, he's second right, isn't he? That's very clearly.
Yeah.
Oh, he's a nice guy, and he ended up doing charitable work the rest of his life.
That's right.
Lovely bloke. And also a shout out to Brad Freeman as well, who I knew. I didn't know as well as Ken, but he was a lovely guy. He was in the 506th. He was Easy Company 506th PIR. Yeah. So he's the Band of Brothers. And I was lucky enough to meet him a couple of times. And again, he was a very modest, very gentle, humble fellow, rather kind of taken aback by the attention. And of course, the attention was because he was one of the last.
Yeah.
But it's that kind of awful feeling, that sort of wistful, sinking feeling you get when you hear the news that you're never going to see them again, that as a representative of that generation, they're among the last, and they slipped away. What's
it going to do to history, though, to the study of it all?
Well, I don't think there'll be any let up in the interest, to be perfectly honest. In one way, it's weirdly kind of, enables you to, because it's very hard for a historian to contradict a veteran. Well,
that's it. That's
actually, they're not always right because, of course.
But that's where I'm going with that question, really. Does this mean at some point you'll be able to sort of, say this is what they thought was happening, but actually that wasn't what was happening at all? Or it may have looked like that from where they were, but it was really quite different.
I don't know. I mean, it's interesting because I've been sort of reading back over stuff that I'm doing a little bit of boning up on certain things and looking back over stuff interviews that I'd done a long time ago. And, I was sort of thinking about the heat wave that's on, and I was thinking about the heat in the desert, and it made me kind of look at, interview I'd done with Sam Bradshaw and Albert Martin for a book I was doing in North Africa, and they were in the early 80s when I interviewed them, so they were incredibly compos mentis, and they both had kept diaries, which they very kindly let me look at, and I was sort of thinking, God, that is the perfect combination. Someone before they're too old, whose memories are crisp, so you can ask them stuff that you can get them to fill in the gaps of questions that you might have that aren't answered by their diaries, but you've got the immediacy of their diaries, and their diaries obviously, they then got interested and got their battalion war diaries as well and all that kind of stuff. So they were pretty on top of the detail, and they were so vivid and I was thinking, gosh, they are good. But then, recent years, veterans, it's all a bit, last decade or so, with a few exceptions, they're all a bit rehearsed. They're all a bit kind of sort of the same old thing that they've said 100 times before and all the rest of it. Which is one of the reasons why, having done Brothers in Arms for Casino, I've been very determined to kind of focus mainly on letters and diaries as my eyewitness accounts, because they're in the moment,
Yeah.
So I think there's no shortage of voices. I mean, the frustrating things is things like, there's just hardly any Indian voices, for example. Hardly any, because the war was then consumed by partition, and no one really thought about doing it. There's never been a kind of oral history program in India or anything like that. So it's just gone, But yeah, it is sad. It is really, really sad. And, they were two really, really impressive people.
Yeah. Well, I think that's probably, we got time for, because we are, we've got lots of last-minute homework to do before
I've got to bone up on Dunkirk.
Yes, you have.
Yeah.
You've covered that before, though, Jim. Let's be honest.
I know, but I've just gone through my PowerPoint. I've got some cracking pictures. It's a story that you can never get bored of.
So just Dunkirk. And are you? Because we all know the James Holland method, which is to say that if the Battle of Britain started on the 3rd of September 1930, when did Dunkirk start, Jim?
Well, there might be a little bit of nod to Fighter Command.
Yeah, but when did it start? That's what I want to know. If I'm reading the James Holland book about Dunkirk, where are you going to start, Jim?
Well,
May 10th?
Well, no, I think it's got to be 3rd of September, isn't it? No, I'm starting very strictly with Sunday the 26th.
Oh gosh.
Yeah.
Amazing.
I'm doing it. It's a week. It's that week. Okay. It's Sunday to Saturday.
But by the way, on the subject of preparation, I spoke to my father, the Colonel, who's talking about the sappers at Pegasus Bridge. I said, "How are you getting on with your talk?" He says, "Well, I'm just figuring out how on earth they did it." He knows what. He knows
that's
what
one not to miss.
He knows what they did. I'm just trying to figure out how on earth they bloody did it.
That's amazing.
Maybe they brought the bridges in sideways and turned, like how they actually fitted the Bailey bridges in and all that.
Yeah, brilliant.
Anyway,
brilliant.
We will see those of you who are joining us at the weekend. I
will see you in a few hours.
I'll see you in a few hours for sort of heatwave shenanigans, and then we will. We very much look forward to see you at the weekend, and the podcasts will keep coming. Thanks for listening, everybody. See you soon. Bye bye.
Cheerio.